also talk about the correlation between where Christianity grows freely, scientific advancement is follows. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things that I am concerned about it now. I am concerned that we are in a culture right now in which, if you were to look at most scientists in academia, for example, right, and you can talk to people like James Tour, the nanochemist, or Behe, and talk to these folks and say, Michael, hey, what's it like? And are you surrounded by other believers? Probably not.
Yeah.
But a lot of that has to do with what's happening in the academy more than whether or not the worldview is what initiates this type of exploration, or whether this worldview can ground it properly, right?
Yeah.
So I think that what I worry about is that are we now, I worry that we're getting at a point where everything has been so politicized that for political reasons, we want to reject even things that are good, that are centered in a history from Christianity, but we think now they've been politicized for the side we don't like. So therefore, we're not going to encourage our kids to get involved in that. We're not going to say anything positive about the if you're talking negatively about the sciences all the time now in front of your kids, don't be surprised if they don't enter the sciences,
Right.
or if
Yeah.
they enter the sciences but they feel like they have to reject your worldview to do it.
Yeah.
We have to really understand, and this is what we're missing it. We're missing it if we think that there's no connection between faith and science, that there never has been, there never can be, and they're irreconcilable. So therefore, and then, by the way, they've weaponized that thing against us anyway. So please do not get, but that's what the enemy uses. The enemy is using science.
Right.
Okay, if we start
Right.
taking that view,
Oh man,
you,
that's
and
like
you know,
when people claim and forgive me for this sidetrack, but that's when people claim that like, say Christmas is pagan. You're like, and you're like, well, that's not actually factually true, but because you believe that, you're sort of handing it over to others as a weapon against Christianity,
yeah,
and when instead of using it for what it is. But I've talked to people tried to talk about the philosophy of science, and that there's a Christian worldview that grounds science well, and it in society it promotes science practically, and I've had people respond, there is no such thing as a worldview in association with science. There is no such. I said, well, yeah, it's the philosophy of science, and then the response is online, there is no such thing as a philosophy of science. You're such an idiot, and I'm
yeah,
like, and I just think they don't know. They don't even
yeah.
know, because like you said, they take so much for granted.
Well,
They
even if
don't.
you said there is
Yeah.
no such thing as as a structured view that guides science, that is a view that you think is guiding science.
Yeah.
It's really hard to step away from views of any practice, of any endeavor, and of the world in general. We all hold some lens through which we see things, and we say, well, no, that's out of bounds, based on the presuppositional lens that we're holding. Now that's just true for everybody. I mean, it's really hard to avoid these kinds of claims about truth.
Right.
Now, all we're saying is that you have to, all of us would have to be at least open to the idea that we have to guard ourselves from presuppositions that could keep us from truth. That's it. I mean, look, in every jury selection, that's the first thing we're doing in the voir dire process, is we are simply asking this set of 75 jurors, we're only going to pick, let's say, 16, 12 for the box and 4 alternates. Okay, we have 75 or 100 to pick from. How are we making our choices? For the most part, we're simply eliminating people with presuppositional biases in one direction or the other, either for or against us, because the defensive team is doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So why are we doing that? Because we know it's why we call these presuppositional. They start. You can't get off the track. You can't get off the starting line if you hold a bias that inhibits the way you're going to run. So we have to. That's the first thing you have to. That's why the first thing I wrote in a book called Cold Case Christianity is you start your investigation with the first tool in your detective bag, which is don't be a know-it-all. Don't think I know who did this before I actually discover who did this.
Yeah.
And this is why I think, to say, for example, that anything supernatural is automatically the interaction of a divine being is just rotely out of bounds. I mean, don't I want the data to kind of guide me to make that decision? I've already decided that of all the causes possible for anything, there are certain causes I would never consider.
Right.
Well, I'm not suggesting that those are going to be the causes you discover. Maybe they won't be. But why wouldn't you leave them in the palette of possibilities until you determine which is most reasonable? I mean, I consider everything. People say, well, you never considered a ghost or a divine being in any of your homicide investigations. Well, look, why? Because it turns out that really quickly you get there and you realize that all the data points to something else.
Right.
I never got to a point where I was like, wow, the only explanation for this is something supernatural.
Mhm.
Although the most popular investigative shows on TV are people who find themselves in positions where they think there is the most reasonable inference, right? And by the way, what gets me is how many of the non-believers in our world love those shows.
Yeah.
It's not that there's God as the super. It's this other. I was telling somebody, here in California, in this crazy housing market we're in, if you get killed in your house, you have to disclose that to the realtor.
Yeah. Well, someone else does because you're dead.
Yeah, you're dead, right? So your family's got to disclose. Yeah, he was
Yeah.
killed in the house. Well, why is that? Because people don't want to buy houses that have ghosts of a murderer.
Yeah.
So all of us are like spooked. There's a point at which all of us default back to some belief in the supernatural, right? I mean, don't tell me you don't watch Paranormal the first time it came out. I remember.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
And we watched. My daughter's a big horror fan, so we were when she was in like high school. If mom was gone, we would watch horror films and eat pizza. Okay, so
I'm one of those rare people that just doesn't have any interest whatsoever in horror.
No, I get it, but I'm telling you, if you watch those things, I'm not a rational person, but you do like walk into the dark bedroom differently, than you did before you watch. So in the end, we all have a sense that this is still inbounds. Oh, but if we're doing science or history, it's out of bounds.
Yeah, and it's there at the grounding, it's there at the foundation, and so what are some of the categories that you said? You mentioned art, you mentioned science. What are some of the other categories that maybe people wouldn't expect to see Jesus having this outsized impact around the world?
Yeah, well, I think that so we tried to do two things in the book, right? Number one, show that, but I got a bunch of books here on my shelves that other people have written, and some really good ones. It talks about the impact of Jesus on the world. Okay, great. I needed to know, can you reconstruct the story of Jesus from the impact? So you might say, well, yeah, he's had a huge impact on modern education, and he certainly has, because that worldview that establishes a teaching commission to teach others and disciple them. One of the most ancient texts in all of Christendom after the Gospels is a book called the Didache. Right, it's the teaching of the 12 apostles to the nations, and it was a book that was used to catechize young Christians. In other words, there's a bunch of principles that need to be learned by new Christians, and so that one of the first documents of the ancient church is a teaching manual. Well, this ends up becoming what happens in monasteries, what happens in cathedral schools, and then ultimately from the cathedral schools blossoming into the universities. But here's what's interesting. And I started thinking about this many years ago when I first looked at this as a non-believer, because I knew even at UCLA there were a couple of Bible verses on Royce Hall. So I knew that, it's interesting that there would be this kind of shadow of Christianity in the educational. So how many of these schools, I wondered, were founded by Christians? That's something that we miss. I mean, if you look at the number of universities founded by worldviews that had a head start on Jesus, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroaster, any of the ancient religious views, and compare the number of universities that they founded, even Judaism, to the number of universities founded by Christians today. It's like a 10-to-1, all the others combined to Christians. Wow. I think more universities, Christian universities, have already fallen away than probably have been founded by some of these groups.
Yeah, the more secular kind of either deist or atheist worldview comes in and takes over.
That's right.
And says we have to gut the Christianity out of this thing. But they're not usually starting as many things.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is they want to gut the ideologies out, which they do. I think you'd see this. I mean, the top 75 of the top 100 universities in the world today were founded by Christians. The top 15, period, were all founded by Christ followers. Yeah. But you wouldn't know that if you were to look at the curriculum in those schools today. But here's what's interesting. Universities love old buildings because that is kind of what demonstrates their authority.
Gravitas.
Their gravitas. Great way to put it. So they don't tear things down. Well, some of the most ancient buildings on every campus are the first buildings they taught classes in. Usually they're chapels. Yeah. And if you go to those buildings, you will still now a couple of them have been remodeled, I noticed, doing the research. But most have not. And you will find on their surfaces the Bible verses, the pictures of Jesus, the stained glass windows of Jesus. You can reconstruct the story. And I've got a list of what you can know about Jesus from just the campuses of the top 15 universities in the world. So unless you're willing to knock down those old buildings or completely remodel them, you are stuck with the person of Jesus on the architecture. And if you look at the charters of those schools, so from the charters and the structures, you're stuck with Jesus. He's hidden in the nooks and crannies. Now, my question is, can you reconstruct the story of Buddha from the top 15 universities in the world?
Yeah,
No, you cannot.
Probably not.
There's no
Yeah.
other historical figure. Even if it's somebody who was venerated by, there's a building dedicated to this historical figure in that region, who was important donor you still can't reconstruct his narrative.
Yeah.
But you can on Jesus. If I knew where to look and I was an alien stepping into the culture, I would go, who is this Jesus guy? Because he seems to pop up in the weirdest places. They don't even seem like they're connected. Like, how is the world of music connected to the educational system or the sciences?
Yeah.
Yet you'll find his fingerprints in all of those places.
Oh, I love this.